Hi, I'm Bryan Donovan from the Hudson Republican Committee, and joining me tonight is Corey Lewandowski from the Americans for Prosperity. Corey, thanks for joining us. Americans for Prosperity, can you tell us a little bit about the organization? When was it started? It's a national organization. Maybe you can fill us in a little bit of the details there. And as the New Hampshire connection, maybe tell us about what that entails as far as your role in the organization.
Sure, be happy to. Thanks for having me tonight.
Sure.
Americans for Prosperity is a 501c3 and a 501c4 organization. So all that means is legally there are two separate companies according to the IRS. So the C3 is our educational component that does issues like scores legislation. The C4 is the ability that allows us to go and advocate for or against piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. So the organization itself was founded in 2006. It currently has 31 state chapters. I am the New Hampshire State Director, a resident of the town of Windham, where I live with my wife and 4 kids, 5 and under. So a very full house over there. And our chapter has been active for almost 4 full years now. We launched it in June of 2008 and have really grown that to an organization where now we feel we can be very effective advocating for legislation and educating the people of New Hampshire about issues we think are important.
Mm-hmm. And really, that's the legislation is really the main focus of the organization. And I know that obviously last year, 2011, was really a very full session as far as legislative activity. From the perspective of Americans for Prosperity, what were some of the key legislations from last year, and who were the folks that really passed that and kind of pushed the ball over the line for you?
Well, it was really nice when we went up to Concord at the beginning of the last legislative session. It was such a change. Obviously, the 2010 elections brought with it supermajorities for the Republicans in both the House and the Senate. So we saw a complete dichotomy from where the legislature was just 2 years ago, where they were pushing tax and fee increases. You know, with the election of Bill O'Brien as the Speaker of the House, top-down leadership in the House is really, they made a commitment back then to focus on smaller government, less regulation, lower taxes. And right off the bat, they came out with a state budget, a biannual budget that was an 11% across-the-board reduction. And that was a big difference. Mm-hmm. You know, on the Senate side, we saw our Senate Bill 2 and Senate Bill 3 pushed through, which were ultimately passed by the House. And what those two pieces were, Senate Bill 2 said to the towns that you can put a spending cap in. In other words, you don't have to spend all the money. You can limit how much money you spend. And Senate Bill 3 was something that Senator Bradley has focused on, and that was pension reform. And that was a big piece of legislation, very contentious. And there was pension reform for public employees who are working for the state or the county or the city. And what it said, the big difference was, as opposed to your 3 highest year earnings, giving you a pension based on your number of years, but your overall compensation for your pension was based on your 3 highest years. They changed that because there was a lot of spiking going on. People would get in there and they'd say, you know what, I'm going to bang in 3 good years and get my pension for more than I ever made before. They changed that so now it's a 5-year system. So it's over a 5-year period. Also, you can't get out after 20 years if you're 40 years old anymore. People were getting into the system at 20, doing their 20 and getting out at 40 and collecting a pension for life. And the taxpayers couldn't sustain that. So Senate Bill 2 and Senate Bill 3 were good positive bills that came out in 2010. The House budget came through there, which was a great piece of legislation. We're very happy with that. And another big piece of legislation which we worked on, which ultimately we were not successful in getting codified into law, was something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, commonly referred to as RGGI. And what that is a regional cap-and-trade program. 10 Northeast states decided to get together and sell carbon credits. And they would force companies to go and buy these credits. But Public Service of New Hampshire right now, or whoever your electric supplier is, mine's PSNH, will collect every month a tax, a hidden tax on your electric bill. Mine's about 35 cents a month. And what it says is we're going to take that money, we're going to go buy these credits. And with your tax money, we're going to spend that for politically connected for-profit companies. And some of the companies that got money were Stonyfield Yogurt, which is a division of the Dannon Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar company.
Sure.
There's a large private institution, a college in the northern part of the state, I think you know, who has an endowment of over $1 billion, right? Very exclusive organization. They received hundreds of thousands of dollars of this type of money. And it's taxpayer money, it's ratepayer money. And we proposed having the state of New Hampshire, remove themselves from that legislation so that the ratepayers wouldn't have to pay this money and given it to these for-profit companies. And ultimately, the House and the Senate both passed versions of that bill to extract New Hampshire. Unfortunately, Governor Lynch vetoed that legislation, and it went back, and there was not enough votes in the House there wasn't enough votes in the House, but in the state Senate, where the Republicans have a 19-seat out of 24-seat majority, they could not come up with 16 votes to override the governor on that issue. So unfortunately, New Hampshire is still part of that terrible program.
Yeah, that was very disappointing. And as a matter of fact, we had Senate President Peter Bragdon at one of our monthly meetings, and he'll tell you that basically for them to get out, there's no incentive for them to get out of that program, because if they do, the businesses here in New Hampshire are still buying that energy from suppliers that are built in that cost. So there's really no advantage for the business community to do that. But still, it's very frustrating to see that we couldn't get that passed through the legislation. Now, is there any chance that might come up again in this session, in the 2012 session, do you think? The Reggie...
Yes, Representative Jim Garrity, who is the lead sponsor in the House and the chairman of the committee which jurisdiction in the House, has reintroduced the bill. Mm-hmm. I have spoken with Senator Bragdon, and I respectfully disagree with his assessment. Here's the crazy thing. Public Service of New Hampshire, who is the supplier of most of our electric in the state, collects this fee. They then applied to themselves for $4 million of the fee which had been collected to upgrade their facilities to make them more energy efficient. Now, wow. I think it just stinks of, impropriety. It is completely legal, but to collect money from the ratepayers to then upgrade your own facility, this is a multi-billion-dollar, for-profit company that has their own resources to go and upgrade their facility. If that's what needs to be done, don't take the ratepayer money.
Right, exactly.
And if this was such a great program, with all due respect to Senator Bragdon, the states like New York that had an opportunity to get into the program, which didn't, states like New Jersey, which just got out of the program by executive order of Governor Chris Christie, would have stayed in. Mm-hmm. This notion that a regional cap-and-trade program was going to benefit these 10 Northeast states has fallen by the wayside because the federal government will not implement a national cap-and-trade program. So, unfortunately, the states that participate, states like New Hampshire and Maine, are subjected at the will of the states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, who really drive this market. And unfortunately, us ratepayers just pay more. So we're hopeful in 2012, Representative Garrity's bill will pass through the House, which we're confident in, and potentially we can get Senator Bragdon and Senator Odell and others who were against the legislation last year to come around and let the ratepayers keep more of their money.
Well, first of all, for PSNH, would you say it was $4 million?
$4 million.
And what does that have to do with improving, greenhouse gas for them to be able to essentially, underwrite an investment in their business on the backs of their taxpayer or the ratepayers? And number two, that sounds like something that I think there's a lot of people that were looking at that legislation last time and were very upset how that was handled, especially by the Republicans in the Senate. So for anybody that's watching, that's a topic that they need to keep on the radar, because it sounds like it's coming back for 2011 or 2012, and it's good to know that if that's something that you're interested in, stay on top of your state senators. I think that's probably where the battle's going to be again. Our state senator Sharon Carson, I'm not sure how she voted on the Reggie's legislation. We're going to talk about the AFP scorecard in a little while here. Now, another thing that you had mentioned before, going back to the 2011 legislation, was the reform of the pension. And I had mentioned to you, just in today's Telegraph, there was an article about, I think it was maybe yesterday, a judge here in New Hampshire has basically kicked out, really, some of the rate pay of the increase for the veteran employees, I guess. Kind of you can't charge one group of employees a different rate from another group of employees. So I would think that means they're going to have to raise the level of everybody, because the reality is we have an unfunded system, and we're talking it's actually $4.7 billion, as I'm sure you know. That a lot of that money needs to come from the residents of New Hampshire, because as a taxpayer, as a property taxpayer, a component of that is going to offset those obligations. So really, everybody, if you own property in the state of New Hampshire, you're on the line for that $4.7 billion. It's going to come from us. A portion of that's coming from us. So that's another thing I think we have to be on top of. And I guess at this point, we're going to have to wait and see how the chips fall. What's going to be the strategy going forward on pension reform. Some of the things were upheld that was good. Obviously, it took a lot of guts by the Republican majority in 2011 to tackle that issue. And New Hampshire's not unique in the fact that these public sector unions in their pensions, which are defined benefit pensions, things that really are not, those days are long gone in the private sector, having a defined benefit plan.
Well, they are, and here's the big difference is, I understand if the state makes a commitment to somebody and says, when you came on board, we're going to grant you this, but times change, and no one could have predicted the economic collapse, and unemployment in this country is still over 10%. In some places, it's over 25%. So this notion that you're guaranteed a job for life is a bit preposterous, particularly for guys like us that work in the private sector. So here's the problem with the pension system. Guys get into the system and they abuse it. Not everybody, because the average person's pension in the state of New Hampshire is $19,000, and that's a reasonable thing, and I don't think any taxpayer or ratepayer thinks that that's unreasonable for the people who go in, do their job. But there's always that percentage of people, and every now and then, Seacoast Online, yes, I had a story, the highest pensioners in the state, police, fire, superintendents of schools. Because what they do is they take advantage of the system. They'll go in, they'll spike their pay, they'll work double overtimes, it'll become a pass-through, and you know what their answer was? I risk my life every day for the job. I need to do this. I don't buy that. We have choices in this country. You don't have to be a public employee. And the other thing is, just this week, a study came out that says public sector employees are no longer compensated at a lower rate than private sector. As a matter of fact, the converse is true. So now you've got public sector employees that make more money than their private sector, colleagues, plus they have a pension.
Yeah.
You know what the pension is at my company? Whatever you can save. Hopefully the market doesn't fall through the floor. Hopefully your 401k doesn't become a 201k, right? Hopefully your real estate when you buy it is worth more, when you sell it than what you bought it for. And hopefully you have enough money that you've saved when you decide to retire. That could be 50, 55, 60, 65, 70. There's no guaranteed pension in life. And these notions that people are entitled to pensions is just, it's a system that has gone by, the way the dodo bird. It just shouldn't exist anymore.
Right. Well, the other aspect of it is that, there's a big difference from a economic point of view. Private sector pension or private sector unions versus public sector unions. In my book, in the private sector, you've got the profit motive. So you've got, I remember when I was in high school when we were learning about, the labor movement and the American labor movement. In looking at, Carnegie, Frick, the robber barons, those guys didn't care anything about their employees, and obviously they were out to maximize their profit. So, and they would do anything really to make a buck. But in the public sector, you don't have that profit motive. And unions play a role in the private sector, and there's nobody begrudges those folks to make an honest living. But that's a little bit different than what I think on the public sector side. And when you have a small state like New Hampshire with a $4.7 billion deficit, we've got to look at that, I believe, and for this judge to be making changes, obviously they have their legal aspect that they have to maintain. But I, as a taxpayer here, look at that and say, there's some way that we have to address that. And like I said before, nobody has a private or a defined benefit plan anymore. It's just ridiculous. Now, the other thing that we talked about, you kind of started in the budget votes. And that's a big part of the A4P scorecard that we're going to take a look at. But that really was a gutsy vote by a lot of folks, because for you to kind of come out of the gate with an 11% decrease in a budget is not obviously an easy thing to do. And you must have been involved with a lot of those battles, I'm sure.
Leading up to the 2010 election cycle, Americans for Prosperity and our honorary chairman, his name is Tom Thompson. His father was the governor of our state, Mel Axe, the Tax Thompson. We put together this pledge, and the pledge is very straightforward, very simple. It said, if elected, I will do the following things. I will cut taxes, cut regulation, and uphold the principles of our Constitution. Cut taxes and fees. And we had hundreds of people who ran for office from local level up to governor, sign that pledge. So we reminded people when they were putting that budget together, you pledged to the people of the state of New Hampshire that you'll do something to cut taxes and fees. And I really believe that leadership started at the very top. When Bill O'Brien became the Speaker of the House in New Hampshire, he fundamentally believes, and I have to agree with him, the government is not the solution, the government is the problem. So return the money either to the local level or, more importantly, to the taxpayers. And he put together a budget with his team in place. And on the Senate side, Senator Chuck Morse from Salem put together a budget that was an 11% decrease. Now, that doesn't mean every program was cut by 11%. What it meant was these department heads had to prioritize, and you have to absorb an 11% decrease. And there is something to be said because it became the first time in years that the state was holding these department heads accountable. And if you remember when John Stephen ran for office, part of his platform for governor was 10% across the board. And Governor Lynch sat there and said, that's an irresponsible thing to do. You can't do it. We're not going to do it here in New Hampshire. And you know what happened? Governor Lynch was reelected, and the House and the Senate got together, and they passed that. And they said, Governor, good luck vetoing that bill. We've got enough votes to override you. And that's exactly what happened. They passed that legislation, and guess what? People still get their paychecks. The government is still functioning. State troopers are still getting paid. The hospitals didn't close down. The roads didn't deteriorate to the point of, unsustainability. So it can be done, but it takes leadership to do it. And, we played a very small role. It takes a lot of courage from the elected officials up there who are getting the calls from their constituents to say, you can't cut this budget. I need this money. But they stood up and they did the right thing for the long-term benefit of our state. And we're actually putting money now back into the rainy day fund, which is something that has been rated. That fund is designed for exactly what it says it is, a rainy day. When the economy is bad again and the state bonds are going down, we need to have a piggy bank. A savings account is what this is. And nobody funded that thing for 4 years. And now the Speaker has said, look, if we've got extra money, let's not keep it in the general fund because it'll get spent. We don't have a revenue problem, we've got a spending problem. Put the money into the rainy day fund, and I think that's the right step.
Well, New Hampshire's on a 2-year budget cycle, correct? So now in 2012, we're really not going to have a lot of budget legislation, I would imagine, correct?
That's right.
So we don't have to worry about that right now. But what are some of the legislation that's coming down the road now that you're watching, your group's watching, that we want to make sure that everybody that's watching this stays on top of?
There's really two big pieces of legislation which the House and the Senate have tackled in 2012. One is called CACR 6, and that's a proposed constitutional amendment. So it originated in the House, it was passed, it went over to the Senate. As a matter of fact, they just passed it this week. And what it says is, this will now go to the citizens. So when you go to the ballot box in November to vote, this will be on the ballot. And what it says is, if the citizens approve, it will change the New Hampshire Constitution to require 3/5 of all of the elected officials present and voting to vote in favor of a tax or a fee increase. So right now the way it works is 50% of the body that shows up plus one vote, you can raise a tax or a fee on any of the people in New Hampshire. That's too easy, and it puts too much politics into this issue. CACR 6 says, look, if we need to raise revenue, you can still do it, but you've got to get 60% of the vote. Very important. The House and Senate just passed that. It's a great piece of legislation that's going to come to the voters. The next one is CACR 13, again, a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution of New Hampshire to never impose an income tax on the residents of New Hampshire. This is a phenomenal piece of legislation. This will literally put in the New Hampshire State Constitution that says you cannot have an income tax. We are the live free or die state. We pride ourselves in not having that broad-based tax. If a candidate were to run for governor as a pro-income tax person and decided that they want to implement an income tax, if the voters of our state speak and say no income tax, it will change the Constitution, and they can't do it. So those are two great pieces of legislation which they're considering right now and trying to get to the voters. Another one is something called Senate Bill 227. This is actually before Senator Sharon Carson's committee. And what this is reforming the Board of Tax and Land Appeal. Nobody knows what the Board of Tax and Land Appeal does. I looked at their budget. This is a 10-person all-in staff Their budget from the legislature is $1,155,000. They hear approximately 98 cases a year. This is kind of the lower tier of the superior court. So if you've got a tax concern, perhaps your local assessor has untaxed you fairly, or you believe so, you could appeal your decision to them. However, at the average salary of about $110,000 per person, I think it's time to get rid of that. Let these people, like many other boards in New Hampshire, serve on a per diem basis, get their mileage, and I'm sure we can find good, competent people in New Hampshire to adjudicate these cases for us without spending north of $100,000 per person.
Now, those first two legislation that you mentioned that were the constitutional amendments, is there any opposition against those bills that you know?
Oh, sure, of course. You know, the notion that the individuals of New Hampshire are sophisticated enough to vote on what they want is troubling to some of our elected officials. They think they have to tell us what we want and what we don't. So just last week, there was an amendment in the state Senate to actually gut part of that CACR 6, the one that would require 3/5 of those present voting for a tax and fee increase. I am proud to say that after some much consternation and consideration, the senator who was going to propose that amendment had pulled it back and allowed the bill to move forward. But on the other side of the aisle, to be clear, there is a clear path here where some of those individuals think an income tax on our people of New Hampshire is the right path. And so they don't want to see this piece of legislation get to the voters, because in a very difficult economy, and New Hampshire's fared much better than many other states. We've got a fairly low unemployment. The people, the business people that go to work every day, I believe, are going to go there and say, no income tax, and make it harder to raise taxes and fees. And that is exactly the opposite of what some other people think, because they think government is the solution and not the problem.
So those two bills have been approved by both sides of the House. Governor Lynch stands where on those two?
Here's the best part. Because these are constitutional amendments and not standard pieces of legislation, the governor is irrelevant. They don't make it to his desk. So I believe CACR 6, which was voted on just this week in the Senate, the constitutional amendment to require a supermajority, is now going to make its way to the ballot box. So the voters, when you show up at the polls in November, are going to have the ability to look at that and say yes or no, that's what I want.
Put it in the people's hands.
That's it, right? I mean, look, we have a great legislature. 400 members elected. Each one represents about 3,300 people, other than some multi-member districts. You know, this is what it's about. Let the people decide. And if the people of New Hampshire walk into the ballot box and say, don't change the Constitution, we want to have the option for an income tax, and don't make it more difficult to raise our taxes and fees, then the people have spoken. That's how democracy works. Right. I don't think that's what will happen, but it could.
No. So your group, Americans for Prosperity, let's say that both of those CACR, what was it, CACR 6
and 13,
and 13 passed. They're on the ballot. What would A4P's role in trying to get the word out, or what are those? Is that a role for your organization?
It is, and really, it's about economic freedom. We believe, and what our mantra is smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation. If there is a system in place which would make it more difficult for our elected officials to raise your taxes, then I think we're going to go out and try and make that happen. So there are 14 states in the country right now that have what is called supermajority legislation. So not just that 50% plus one, you need a bigger number. Some states have 60%, as we're proposing here. Some have 66. And by no means do I think California is the model that we in New Hampshire want to follow. However, they have supermajority legislation. And last year in their budget battle, what they wanted to do is they want to go and raise taxes because they don't have enough money to literally keep the state afloat. It's about to go into bankruptcy. But because they couldn't meet that threshold, because they couldn't get the 60% needed, you know what they did instead? They cut spending. That's what we should be doing.
Now, when did they implement that supermajority?
So they've actually had theirs for a number of years. And the only thing that prevented California, I truly believe this, from going into receivership and being taken over by the federal government is that they couldn't spend any more money. They tried to go and raise more revenue, and they didn't get the votes to do it, which was, I believe, the right thing. So they had to go back and say, okay, I guess we've got to cut some money out of some programs. And amazingly, they actually went out and find a way to cut some spending. And that's really what this is about, is there's no endless supply of money. This isn't legislators' money. This is our money.
Right.
This is the people's money.
Right.
Give it back to them. You know what? If we've got a surplus and it's reasonable, you'll never see this. You know, here's your check back. You've overpaid.
Right.
You know, reduce the property taxes. You know what the rates are. I mean, you know, in our town of Wyndham, it's $22 per thousand. And for easy math, if you get a $1 million home, it's $22,000 a year. If you get a $500,000 home, it's $11,000 a year. And that's in addition to everything else you're paying for.
Sure.
And we don't have trash pickup, or, you know, they don't maintain my road. I plow it myself. So, you know, there is only so much money to go around, and it's really incumbent on our elected officials to give the opportunity for the citizens to determine if they want to spend more money. And if the citizens say yes, then they've got a mandate. I don't think that's the case, and that's why we saw that major change in the 2010 election cycle.
Now, Corey, the group has put together a scorecard, and actually we've created a slide which is going to be visible to the viewers here. And the scorecard basically represents the voting record for this past year for the state reps and also the state senators. And luckily here in Hudson, our reps did a fantastic job. We've got Lars Christensen, Bob Hefner, Sean Jasper, Russ Ober, and John Maltz all had an A+. Jordan Uleri, Lynn Ober, and Andy Renzullo had an A. Now, I know in talking to a lot of the reps, especially Andy Renzullo, he was a little bit perturbed from a scoring point of view. He's pretty sure he got an A+, but anyways, Andy's an A+ guy, there's no doubt about it. But to me, when we look at our state reps here in Hudson, we've got an outstanding group. Now, we do have one that has a score of C. That's Randall Brownrigg. And our state senator, Sharon Carson, who happens to be from Londonderry, but she's in District 14, so Hudson, Londonderry, and Auburn, has a rating of B. So these scorecards, like we were just talking about, what's that meant to do, and why do you put those together, and what does that really show the folks here in New Hampshire?
Well, it's a couple things. You know, we score things based on an economic impact, so there's no social issues. In order to get an A+, you would have to have been present on every vote that was taken and voted what we believe to be the right position. So of the 10 issues that we scored for the House members, if you were only present for 9, even though you might have voted appropriately for all 9, you can't get an A+ just by default. So what this means is, you know, here in Hudson, you've got some great representation up in Concord who believe in economic freedom, voting to, you know, cut taxes, cut fees, cut spending, really important. And here's the great part is, you know, we put a lot of time into making sure that the scorecard is accurate and reflects, you know, the issues that we think are important. And then we take that scorecard and we distribute it to our membership across the state. You would be amazed at how many elected officials take that book and look up their name right away, and they want to know what they are, and if they've got a B or a C or a D, why did I get it? And in the House, the vast majority, now there are 294 Republicans in the House, the vast majority of those members are either A or A+. And then you've got this huge dichotomy on the other side, and there's probably 100 that are just D's or F's. Mm-hmm. And there's a very, very small percentage. And I think that's because, again, if you look back at the 2010 cycle, the individuals that ran for office and were successful believed in that smaller government, returning control to the electorate, the people. In the state Senate, it's very different. There were 3 state senators total of the 19 Republicans and 5 Democrats that received an A+. And then there were, I think, all 5 Democrats, unfortunately, got an F. And this is just like if you were in grade school, right? In order to get better than an F, you've got to get better than 60%. And if you got a D, you get a little bit, you get 65%, etc. So it's very simple to understand. But what you see is the Senate is much more moderate in terms of the legislation that they want to consider, the things that they want to vote on, and that's a top-down approach from the Senate. So, there are a number of new senators that came in the 2010 election. Senator Jim Forsythe from the Lakes Region got an A+, Andy Sanborn, Senator Ray White from Bedford, Jeannie Forster from Meredith got an A, John Gallus. That said, there were some new senators who represent maybe more difficult districts who get B's or C's. Gary Lambert, who's a great American just on principle, he got a B. There are some issues that we just disagree with him on, and maybe it's his district or his personal beliefs, but we try and make this as easy as possible, these scorecards. You guys are very fortunate. I can tell you I've been to a lot of other areas of the state where there's a lot of D's and a lot of F's, and there aren't many conservatives over there, so you're blessed.
Well, and then the score obviously represents their voting record over a large amount of legislation last year. So if anybody wanted to check the scorecard out themselves, is it available on your website? And what is the website address?
It is. It's AmericansForProsperity.org is our website, and across the top you'll see a button that says State Chapters. You'll have all of our states listed. Obviously, you click on New Hampshire. On the right side, you'll see all of the candidates that ran for office last cycle who signed our no tax pledge. They're all listed on the website by office that they ran for in alphabetical order. You'll also see on there our scorecard. You can click on it. You can go through. It's a PDF format. You can search it. It shows all the legislation that we scored, what we believe to be the positions that were appropriate for the people, and how your elected officials voted. So AmericansForProsperity.org, then you click on where it says State Chapters, you go right to New Hampshire, and on that page you'll see my testimony of things that we're doing, events that we're hosting. All of it is updated almost daily.
Yeah, well, I actually attended one of your meetings and have a copy of it, and we actually distributed it at one of our town meetings, Republican Town Committee meetings. And obviously there's a tremendous amount of work that went involved with this, so that's excellent. And that's great information for anybody that wants to keep on top of their legislators and see how they're voting and see what legislation that you guys are tracking. Now, one of the things you spent a lot of time talking about the budget votes of 2011, and obviously, that was a really courageous vote by a lot of the Republicans, especially our Republican reps here in Hudson, to put in a budget that was like that with an 11% decrease. One of the things that people had, there was a lot of conversation about the change to the sales tax for cigarettes. Now, you just happened to mention that the revenue information just recently received for last January, so January of 2012, is in. What's the good news on the revenue that we saw?
Well, the good news is candidly, the revenue for the state of New Hampshire for January of 2012 is up $14.3 million over projections. So when the legislature put their budget together, they took the most conservative revenue numbers because we were in a down economy, and we're still there. Let's not kid ourselves. But the fact that the money is in higher, the $14.3 million more than what was projected to come into the state in January, is a good sign. On top of that, as you remember, there was a lot of controversy, as you mentioned, on cutting the cigarette tax. And you heard all the ridiculousness that this wasn't going to work and we're helping the tobacco companies. Here's what happened in January. The numbers were just released. $900,000 more than what was projected for the January tobacco tax money has come in, meaning the state has collected almost, just on tobacco sales alone, $1 million more than projected in last year's budget. And if you look at these numbers, what it says is 77.4% increase in the business tax, meaning businesses are actually doing better, the economy is turning around, the state is collecting more revenue, and that's a positive sign for us. So this goes to show that if you cut taxes and cut spending, there is a path to victory at the end, because the residents from Massachusetts, here in Hudson, I live in Windham, they come across the border, they buy their cigarettes, they buy their alcohol, and they don't just buy 2 things, they buy 5 things, 10 things. They come to the Rockingham Mall to shop, right? They come to the Pheasant Lane Mall to shop because it's tax-free, and that is what is helping our state. That's why we have a competitive advantage. That's why we have a New Hampshire advantage, and by cutting those taxes, I know there's a lot of criticism in the past. The numbers bear out today that was the right thing to do.
Well, that's a great message, because we were just talking before. I think it was just within the last couple of weeks. I either saw an article in the National Telegraph, or it might have been one of the letters to the editors, where somebody was saying what a ridiculous concept it would be to cut cigarette taxes in order to generate revenue. And obviously, that's the reality of it. So it'd be interesting if we see that in the National Telegraph, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. We had talked a little bit about pension reform before. One of the other topics that really kind of was a major factor last year, and I think could be again this year, was right to work. And I know that happens to be a topic that for the Americans for Prosperity is really monitors closely. Is there any update here in New Hampshire on that right to work effort?
There is. Just very quickly, last year in the last legislative cycle, the House and the Senate both passed right-to-work legislation. It was sent to the governor. The governor vetoed that bill, and then it came back to the House for an override. And as I mentioned earlier, there were 294 Republicans. That bill was not overridden. You needed 2/3. You needed 66% of the vote to override the governor's veto. On the day of the vote, the Republicans were able to garner 63.3%, unable to override the governor's veto. So that bill died last cycle. As you probably saw, the state of Indiana just passed right to work last week. I mean, literally, the legislature, the House and the Senate moved almost simultaneously, and then the governor signed the bill in the last week, making Indiana the first right to work state since Oklahoma. New Hampshire has the same opportunity. They're going to reconsider the right to work legislation. This is an issue that is a Republican platform issue, which I don't think a lot of people know. This is a platform issue. So when you run on the Republican ticket and you agree to the platform which has been put forth, right to work is one of those issues. Here's how it works. It's very simple. Right to work is a misnomer. This is the ability for people who work in the public sector to either join or not join a union. It's very simple. So if you want to become a firefighter, police officer, school teacher, if the state of New Hampshire was right to work, you could walk in that very first day and say, I'd like to be part of your union, firefighter, police, teacher. Or you could walk in and say, I choose not to be part of your union. And if I am not part of your union, you don't have to collect a bargain for me. You don't have to do any of the things that come with the benefit of being a union member. However, I don't have to pay my dues. You can't collect my money and use it for things which I don't think are appropriate. So right to work is really about worker choice. And again, I think in this day and age, giving people the ability in a tough economy to decide, that's the job I want, I'm going to go apply for it, but then you're going to force me to pay for something I don't want. I don't think it's right. I don't think the average person thinks it's right. And you'll hear the rhetoric from the teachers that, we have to do this and this will lower the wages. It's malarkey, because if you look at the states across the country that are right to work, there aren't lower wages. South Carolina is a right to work state, and what happens there is Boeing Corporation tried to move a $2 billion facility down there because they can go and work with the people easier than they can the unions. This is all about worker choice, and I think we will see here in New Hampshire this year a right-to-work bill come through the House again. The Senate actually has enough votes to override a governor's veto, so our problem on this particular piece of legislation is actually in the House, which is very different than most of the other issues, and here's why. You've got 294 Republicans. Many of them have a background prior to coming to the legislature as a school teacher, a firefighter, a police officer, or some other public employee. And so they feel vested or obligated to force people into these positions. And it's real simple. If you've got a good union and they're meeting the needs of the people that they're serving, just like any other organization, your membership will follow you. If you ask the Airline Pilots Association, who's a union that represents airline pilots, what's your percentage of participation? 99.99%. Why? Not because it's forced, because you're giving value to the people that you're serving. And the unions don't want to lose that automatic revenue stream, and that's why they're opposed to right to work. So we've got to get New Hampshire this year to become a right to work state, and if not, we've got to make sure we get a governor who next year will sign a right to work bill to make New Hampshire a right to work state.
Well, just thinking, looking at the scorecard, I want to say everybody on the Hudson Reps voted in favor of that. But if anybody wanted to check, they can go to the website, like we had mentioned before, and take a look at that. Yes, and obviously the governor. I mean, really, we were in a situation that both sides of the House passed it last year, but the governor obviously vetoed it. So I believe, I know over LaMontagne, obviously, which is one of the candidates, the leading candidate in the Republican side for the governor's race, is a supporter of that, which is very good. We had talked a little bit about the budgets, and I had mentioned to you before. One of the things that in previous programs that we did, we were talking about the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services and its $4.7 billion budget that's in the current, or its appropriation in the current budget. So $4.7 billion, when you look at the size of our state, there's only 1.3, a little bit less than 1.4 million people in the state of New Hampshire. So that budget, that 4.7 broken down by 1.4 million is about $3,500 per every man, woman, and child in the state of New Hampshire. So you're still talking about a tremendous amount of money that's in the budget for them. Now we just talked about the sales tax or the cigarette tax. starting to generate some revenue. So we can see that with the budget, that we're starting to see some positive things happening. As it relates to health care, what's on the horizon for legislation, specifically here in New Hampshire, for health care, and how might that impact, our budget going forward?
Well, there's two important pieces of legislation. One is Senate Bill 163, which is sponsored by Senator Ray White of Bedford, and that is his desire to set up a health information exchange. As you know, what is commonly referred to as Obamacare was passed at the federal level. And what that said is if the states don't begin to set up something and they term it a health information exchange, then come 2013, the federal government will come in and set up that exchange for you. So a Republican state senator from Bedford, Ray White, has decided to file legislation to begin to set up that exchange. I think it's the wrong position personally. As you know, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments in March on whether or not Obamacare and mandating people to have health care is even legal. They will make a ruling prior to November, which means we will know prior to this 2013 deadline whether or not the bill is even legal. I think what makes a lot more sense is potentially a piece of legislation like House Bill 1560. And what that is, it's something very different. What it says is all the money that we send to the federal government, we're going to ask for it back in a block grant. Okay, we're going to ask for basically whatever we give you, you have the power to collect our revenue. We understand that. We're not. This is not nullification. Block grant all of the health care money, $2.9 trillion a year, back to the state of New Hampshire. Let us set up our own system. If we can run it more efficiently for $2 trillion or $2.5 trillion, guess what? We get to keep that delta. We get to keep $900 million in our account. We get to determine within the guidelines of the federal statutes who gets covered and what the cost is on these things. We can allow competition amongst, carriers in the state. So this is something that I think, look, this is not, there's been some criticism of this piece of legislation, but I can tell you, I believe that bringing the money, not saying we don't send to the government, we bring it back from the government and we let the people in New Hampshire set up a system which is appropriate for the people of New Hampshire. Maybe very different than the people of Vermont who want a single-payer system. Maybe here we want a hybrid of what goes on in other states. Let the people here decide. Let our elected officials become accountable for this system. But if we can run it more efficiently, then I think we should be able to keep that money. Right now, as you know, there is no incentive in the healthcare field to be efficient. There is no benefit to HHS not to spend every single dollar that they're allocated, because if they don't spend it all, then they get their budget appropriation cut next cycle. So we need to put a system in place that says, let's find the best care possible for everybody who needs care at the lowest possible cost, and let's use our buying power of $2.9 trillion worth of health care to make that happen. It's a reasonable request. I think it's much better than jumping forward with this health exchange. Now, you'll get the Business and Industry Association and other entities that say, we've got to set up this exchange. Here's what happens. These aren't my numbers. It's $3,000 per small business in the state of New Hampshire if we set up a health information exchange and have to follow the rules outlined under Obamacare. $3,000 for each business. Now, maybe the BAE Systems of the world don't mind a $3,000 increase, but I can tell you the mom and pop stores that are already, paying a fortune to have full-time employees and giving them health benefits, that $3,000 could be the make or break to decide whether to stay in New Hampshire or close up shop and go somewhere else. So I think that bill, Senator White's bill, is a flawed piece of legislation. It was brought before the state Senate. They basically tabled it. He's trying to re-bring that back forward. And I would encourage all the listeners here to call your elected officials and say, do not move forward with that Senate bill to create a health information exchange.
Yeah, we'll have to check with our Senator Sharon Carson to see what she thinks on that particular issue. Now, the whole idea of block granting that health care money and letting the states determine what they want to do with it, that actually is something that a lot of the presidential candidates are talking about right now. So hopefully that would be a good approach. And I happen to know, in the healthcare business, that the whole discussion of a healthcare information exchange, they've been talking about that for years. It was called a RIO before. There's little different names for that same type of concept. And one of the problems that you have is that hospitals have different computer systems, so it's hard to standardize on that. but the Obama administration with Obamacare, that certainly is a driving factor in that space to kind of unify the systems and share that data. So there's a flip side to that, and there's the data security aspect of it that a lot of folks don't realize as well. But purely from an economic point of view, which I know for Americans for Prosperity, that's one of the major focuses. Healthcare continues to be something that is important. I had mentioned the concept of the block grants being something that a lot of the presidential candidates are talking about. When it comes to presidential elections, is that something that your group gets involved in, or what type of information would they typically put out from a presidential point of view?
You know, we don't endorse candidates. As I said at the onset, we're a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, fully tax-deductible if you want to give to our foundation. We're a 501c4 educational organization that allows us to do advocacy work, again, under the IRS guidelines. We are a nonprofit. So we don't engage in electioneering. We don't engage in endorsements. We don't give money to candidates. What we want to do is simply give out information. And, you know, what you might see from us is a straight side-by-side comparison on, let's say, 2, 3, 4 of the candidates in the race. And those would be economic issues on, does the candidate favor right to work? You know, or is he opposed to it, or she opposed to it? You know, what issues are they in favor of block granting back to the states? Where do they stand on the 10th Amendment issues, economic freedom issues? And we don't want to make an endorsement here. What we say, here, you can decide. We would give you the tools to decide. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the day of the election, we have no vested interest per se of the outcome of that election. We're not here to advocate for or against a Republican or Democrat. What we want is the process to occur. So we want as many people as possible to get to the ballot box, to do their due diligence, to hopefully they have had the opportunity to go to our website, see where the candidates stand on issues, and check the box that they think is most appropriate. That could be President Obama. It could be whoever the Republican nominee is. We just want people to go there and make sure they vote, because we think, you know, looking at CACR 6, that supermajority legislation, and the no income tax legislation, you know, those are things that we want our supporters, for lack of a better term, to go out and make sure that we can help get done.
Well, the other thing I would say is anybody that's interested in some of the topics that we talked about and the work that the Americans for Prosperity group does, go to your website. You can sign up also for email alerts, which I constantly get the email information, which is outstanding, because it really tells you, keeps you up to date on the legislation that's going on in Concord, and kind of gives you a preview of what's going on. And if anybody is interested in contacting their reps one way or the other, that's a great way to find out. So, Corey, I really appreciate the time that you took to come down here in Hudson and have an opportunity to talk to us about that. Great work that you're doing. Keep it up. The scorecard, I think, is outstanding. I'm really glad that our folks here in Hudson, our state reps, are doing an outstanding job. So, once again, thanks for coming in. I'd like to also thank all of our friends here at Hudson Cable TV that do a great job helping us out. We have Michael Keefe and Jim McIntosh, as always, do a great job. Stu Kroner's helping out. Scott Pearson, Chris Scorgio, and my friend Rick Lavasser is here as well. So thank everybody for your help, and we appreciate your time.